Look, the explanation is straightforward. The United States does not tolerate left-leaning governments in South America or Central America, period. As soon as we identify a government considerably left of center, we move to replace it. We have a rich history of this. Ever since Chavez won in Venezuela a decade or so ago, we've had our sights set on that country. Nothing has changed. We want Maduro gone and would prefer installing a right-wing government. If you have any doubts about this, examine our relationship with Cuba since 1959 when Castro took over. We've maintained that hostile posture ever since. We cannot stand the fact that Cuba has a left-leaning government. Is it a security threat? Not in my opinion. But there are plenty of people who think it's an ideological threat. They believe we're in such a precarious position in the Western Hemisphere, maybe around the world, that if there's a left-wing government in this hemisphere, even one that's not coordinating with a distant great power like the Soviet Union, the mere fact of its existence is categorically unacceptable. We go after it almost every time. So the people of a country democratically choose their leaders. Lula in Brazil, hard left, but presiding over a very prosperous country with a major economic base, or Venezuela, not prosperous but potentially so. And we're going to use force to change their government. Sounds like Afghanistan, doesn't it? The fundamental issue is this: we do not believe in sovereignty. It's critical to recognize that the United States thinks it has the right, the responsibility, and the capability to intervene in the domestic politics of every country on the planet when it sees fit. This is how we operate. It's a gross violation of the UN Charter, and everybody understands that when you violate sovereignty routinely, you create a much less peaceful world. But that doesn't matter to us because we're interested in remaking the world in our own image. On the laws of war, yes, there's no question they matter. Let me give you background on this. Militaries are giant killing machines. If you're trained in the U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy, or Marines, in most jobs you're trained to kill people. That's what militaries do. Given that militaries are trained to kill and there's a very powerful tendency to engage in violence, you want rules drilled into everybody's heads so people think twice before engaging in murderous behavior. I'm not talking about normal combat. I'm talking about killing civilians, executing prisoners of war, that sort of thing. It's very difficult when militaries are engaged in combat to keep a lid on things because there's a powerful tendency in these institutions to do unlawful things. So we have these laws. We drill them into people's heads. Everyone understands what those laws are, and it's designed to keep warfare as humane as possible. Then people come along saying that in combat you can do pretty much anything you want. You want to execute a My Lai massacre? Go do it. Well, of course you don't want that situation. You want to do everything you can to prevent a My Lai massacre. That's why you have laws defining what kind of killing is legitimate in war and what kind is not. I do not think what we're doing is lawful. There are lots of other people who don't think so either, including British military intelligence. MI6, the British, our supposed closest allies, will not cooperate with us in the Caribbean because they fully understand what we're doing is unlawful. It's murderous behavior. President Trump can say he has some written mandate authorizing this, but hardly anybody believes that except the people around him and his fervent supporters. I don't think Netanyahu was enthusiastic about the F-35s to Saudi Arabia. The Israelis aren't happy we've agreed to give the Saudis F-35s, but the Saudis are not a problem for Israel. The Gulf states are not a problem for Israel. The Israelis worry more about Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. Those are the principal concerns. And Iran, obviously, that almost goes without saying. But the Saudis don't matter that much. The talk for the past 2 or 3 years about whether you're going to get an Abraham Accord involving Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Israel, the fact that conversation was even taking place tells you the Saudis are not a major problem for the Israelis unless they get sophisticated F-35s. That'll make the Israelis very nervous. But that game hasn't played out yet. The Israelis will go to great lengths to undermine that deal. If they don't undermine it, they'll make sure they get compensated in the extreme. More weaponry, more money, simply because we gave Saudi Arabia 48 F-35s. Is it credible that Israel would use nuclear weapons? It's certainly credible. I have no hard evidence to support this. I'm not saying I doubt it, but I have no hard evidence. Logically, though, it makes perfect sense. You want to remember that the Israelis firmly believe that Iran with nuclear weapons is an existential threat. They believe this nuclear enrichment capability that we attacked on June 22nd of this past year is the beginning of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. They're deeply interested in taking that out. We also know they can't do it themselves. They couldn't do what we did. They just don't have the capability. They don't have bombs that can penetrate that far. So if they can't take out this existential threat with conventional weapons, but think they can do it with a small nuclear weapon, I think the chances they would do it are quite high. If down the road there's solid evidence that Iran is acquiring nuclear weapons, and this was not the case this summer, and the Israelis can't take out that capability with conventional forces, I would bet a lot of money they'll use nuclear weapons. They view this as an existential threat. When it comes to using military force against their adversaries, the Israelis know almost no bounds. We've seen that in recent years. The word restraint is not meaningful when you talk about how the Israelis behave militarily. This is a real threat, not just now, but moving forward. Do we have leverage over Israel? We hardly ever have any leverage over the Israelis, period. But let's put that aside. If the Israelis believe, and I do believe they think this is truly an existential threat, then whether we have leverage in other circumstances is not going to matter. They're going to think their survival is at stake. That's the key to understanding what's going on here. When you talk about an existential threat, you're talking about a threat to survival. This gets back to Ukraine. Putin views Ukraine and NATO as an existential threat. He views it as a threat to Russian survival. Many Westerners don't believe that, but the Russian elite believes it. Coming back to the Israeli case, I don't think Netanyahu is the only person in Israel who thinks like this. They believe Iran with nuclear weapons is a threat to Israel's survival, another possible Holocaust. If you're thinking about Iranian nuclear weapons in those terms, using your own nuclear weapons is not difficult to imagine. And it's very important to understand that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, so it can't retaliate. Going back to Ukraine, one reason I was always very fearful in the first year of the war that Russia might turn to nuclear weapons, because it was doing so badly on the battlefield at the conventional level, is that if Russia used nuclear weapons in Ukraine, Ukraine had no capability to retaliate. It had no nuclear weapons. You have an analogous situation with Israel and Iran. If Israel were to use small nuclear weapons against Iran to take out their enrichment capability or a potential bomb they're developing, they would be very tempted because they would have no fear that Iran could retaliate with nuclear weapons of its own. And no other country in the world is going to come to Iran's rescue with its nuclear arsenal. This is a very dangerous situation moving forward. On these Russian nuclear developments, the most revolutionary element appears to be the miniaturized nuclear reactors. Putin actually said they could use these even for space exploration. There are so many possibilities, and they're not exclusively military. This is a major breakthrough. There's going to be a new Sarmat soon, probably next year, and it's even more powerful than the current one. They're raising the stakes constantly. In terms of continuity in nuclear energy, nuclear power, and its application to ballistic missiles and hypersonics, nobody comes even close to them. The Chinese are way behind. The Americans, 2-3 generations behind. The civilian applications are going to be as important as the military applications. After those tests, there was essentially thunderous silence across the West because they didn't even understand what was happening. They couldn't even place it. They didn't have the conceptual framework to understand these developments and their importance. This is another example of Russians doing what they do without boasting or bragging. When they test something, it's because it's already operational and they've tested it numerous times before. When they have a practical test, that weapon is ready to go online and it goes online. They're already producing Oreshnik in serial production, which was tested only a few months ago. It's a completely different mindset and process compared to the American approach, which is basically bragging about having the biggest military in the history of the galaxies. Well, show us your hypersonics. Do they work? Do you even have them? Putin doesn't go for hyperbole. He's a very measured, cool, calculated individual. When he says something about the next 75 years, it's because his scientists briefed him on the civilian and military applications of these miniaturized nuclear reactors, and they're already working on them. This means not only strategic parity, but strategic deterrence, being above any peer competitor for the rest of the century. Can you imagine how this is being digested in the Pentagon? The first Russian reaction to Trump's nuclear testing comments was, does he know what he's saying? They immediately concluded he had no idea, which is why Putin and Belousov have been very careful to say that if he's actually ordering American nuclear tests from now on, they will do their own nuclear testing as well, obviously. And the Chinese will do it too. North Korea, India, Pakistan, everybody. It's open season on nuclear testing now. This was an official message taken very seriously by the Russians. They're waiting to see if there's movement toward testing. If that's the case, they're in as well. There's probably going to be a line of BRICS nations arriving in Moscow wanting to purchase systems. Assuming the Russians have enough production capacity to fulfill these contracts, India is going to be one of the top customers. But beyond BRICS nations interested in Russian firepower and know-how, we need to go back to the ground-level reality of this hybrid war against the global South as a whole, against BRICS nations, against prospective BRICS nations like Venezuela or partners like Nigeria. Trump has already said that sooner or later the U.S. is going to intervene in Nigeria. This brings us to one of the key issues 1 year after the BRICS summit in Kazan. Is BRICS as a group working on a concerted strategy to at least counter the empire unleashing its fury across the global South? How cohesive is BRICS on this matter? We don't know. There are many signs this cohesiveness is still not there. This is a geopolitical issue, a military geopolitical issue. It's quite different from what BRICS has achieved in geoeconomics and what they agreed in Kazan. On the geopolitical unity front, it's much more complicated. Inside BRICS, you have players that are, well, dodgy is a lenient way of describing them. The United Arab Emirates, for instance, which in Sudan is pitted against another BRICS member, Egypt. They're on opposite sides in Sudan, and the Americans are also looking at Sudan. In terms of Africa, there are so many different hotspots the empire can use to destabilize certain regions. The French were directly involved, the Americans indirectly, in the latest al-Qaeda push in Mali, which apparently for the moment is under control, but they'll be back. They need to destabilize at least one member of the Sahel alliance. Nigeria, energy producer, BRICS aligned. The hybrid war at different levels is the empire against the whole of BRICS, including partners. That's why it's so dangerous. But so far, I have not heard from people close to BRICS officials in several nations that they're actually sitting down to discuss this among themselves in detail. They discuss geoeconomics extensively, settlement systems, increasing trade in their own currencies, but not an overall BRICS strategy to counteract the empire. This is something they should have started yesterday. Sooner or later, we could have a BRICS member falling or a partner falling or direct destabilization of a BRICS member or partner. This is extremely dangerous, but there's still no political will. I'm giving you the realist reading of how this is going. Inside BRICS, everything depends on the Russia-China strategic partnership, and they have so many complicated issues to address at the moment. The three BRICS members that have an orientation toward really accelerating the process are Russia, China, and Iran. Everybody else is kind of playing catch-up, especially geopolitically and politically, so it really is up to them, especially Russia and China, who are in a much more favorable position than Iran, which is surrounded by imperial adversaries. Recently, Malaysia was threatened by the U.S. ambassador, even after they treated Trump almost like one of their sultans when he visited. Extreme courtesy, graciousness, it wasn't enough. The government has to be very careful. They cannot antagonize the Americans frontally. There are substantial American interests throughout Thailand and the region. Although their relationship with China is very strong, the relationship between the Thai monarchy and the Chinese Communist Party is very strong, something few people understand. Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia was vocal at the BRICS summit about anti-colonialism. Then when Trump visited, it seemed like the reverse. But you cannot antagonize him directly. Anwar is one of the smartest diplomats in the world and a survivor. One thing he said to Trump was sophisticated, a seduction approach he knew would work. He said, "Look, I've been to jail. You almost went to jail. We have a few things in common." Trump laughed. Trump got the message. You don't mess with someone who's been to jail, survived, and now leads his country. Same with Lula. Lula has also been to jail. Trump cannot mess with Lula directly. He learned that after their meeting. In the BRICS sphere, you have leaders with enough stature, Lula with global appeal, Anwar with nearly global appeal, who can talk to Trump face to face. They're not scared and not intimidated. When the U.S. ambassador said Malaysia's prosperity comes from deep integration in Western supply chains, he doesn't know anything about intra-Asia supply chains, which are the supply chains that really matter. East Asia, ASEAN, ASEAN with East Asia, especially China. Malaysia is also integrated in global supply chains, but for ASEAN, that starts with the ASEAN 10, China and their partners, the +3, China, Japan, South Korea. These relatively large ASEAN economies, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, are integrated across East Asia, including South Asia with India and Northeast Asia with Japan and South Korea. The American market for them is acceptable, but it's not absolutely essential, not at all. For the smaller countries, it's more complicated because they export textiles. The top Trump tariffs on ASEAN are on the three smallest, weakest ones, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. Trump didn't dare put 40% tariffs on Malaysia or Thailand, but he put them on the three smaller ones. What matters in terms of supply chains is integration all across this region. This was discussed during several summits simultaneously in Kuala Lumpur. Not only the ASEAN summit, but ASEAN Plus 3. ASEAN with other members, RCEP, which includes Australia and New Zealand. 5 summits, all discussing integration of supply chains now threatened by American tariffs on East Asia. I'm talking about the eastern part of Eurasia, which is already immense. If the tariffs continue, they'll simply do more trade among themselves. Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, even Central Asia. And of course with China, which is the #1 trading partner for all of them.